social issues that we're going to be dealing with here in the changes at the High Middle Ages. We're going to be talking about some urbanization, changes in the aristocracy, and those are going to be our major themes for today. All of this, of course, is going to be based on some of the day-to-day patterns, which aren't terribly exciting, seemingly, but this is how people take care of themselves and how they feed themselves. And so what you're going to see is this is going to represent one of the major agricultural shifts that take place here in late medieval, prior to early modern Europe. Now, the Frankish concentration, this kind of cultural preoccupation that they had with agriculture and landholding, fiefdoms, etc., it did limit trade. It was a decentralization in pretty much every facet that you could think of. But it created a big agricultural base for especially local people, right? Now you're going to see some agricultural changes that will really alter the way that society was put together. Major ecological changes in the European land space, for example. A lot of land is cleared off. A lot of water is drained away. For example, in the Netherlands today, something like 2/3 of the country would actually be under sea level if it hadn't been for terraforming and clearing this out. This is going to create a lot more farmland. Swamps are going to be drained for much the same purpose. And when you have a lot more arable land, this is going to create a bigger agricultural base, which is going to allow for a population explosion. Technology is going to change as well. Plows and animal yokes are going to improve greatly. You'll see that, for example, the chest harness as opposed to the throat harness for horses is going to allow them to be a lot more powerful, get a lot more done over the same amount of time. And then the crop rotation system is going to go from a 2-field to a 3-field system with different seasons, with cover crops. And then, of course, you have the fallow ground for animal pastures to allow them to increase their fertility. Right? Now, of course, the land labor is still going to be done by peasants at this point. But they're going to be the ones that are going to be at the bottom of kind of this hierarchical pyramid, right? So who are the peasants? Who are these people, right? The average sort of worker/farmer of the medieval period. Now, these are for the most part landless, and they've got to work for the local lord either due to force, they're the serfs, the landed slaves, or to pay some kind of rent. They're sort of like free peasants to do this. They're on somebody else's property, and they've got to pay some kind of agricultural dues. They're working nearly year-round, right? The church calendar, the liturgical calendar of the Christian church, for example, comes to reinforce a lot of the working norms with the holidays and the seasons corresponding actually pretty tightly with the working seasons of the year, right? Along with the religious festivals. Now, the households at this point evolved to, generally speaking, a nuclear family in a relatively modest home. So this gives you a nice little view of this. These guys are out working, they're planting trees, tilling soil, harvesting different fields, and you can see how different field utilization works. Some of these people are actually working inside on various mills and industries. Whether or not they're working for themselves to pay the rent or whether they're working for the Lord, it isn't shown. But this is what they're going to spend a lot of their time doing. Average kind of peasant woman, kind of what you'd expect with this. All right. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know, depending on how you want to look at it, but what we have in terms of, we talked about primary and secondary sources, is we have a huge amount of source material about and for the aristocracy. Even though they're kind of the smallest slice of medieval society, they have the most written about them because, for the most part, let's face it, they're the ones paying for the entertainment and the written literature of the day, right? So when we talk about the aristocracy, we can get at least something of a window into the medieval world, even though it's sort of skewed through the eyes of the wealthy and the powerful, right? Now, when we talk about the aristocracy, the people born to wealth and power, right, it breaks down, interestingly, into categories for men and women. Now, for aristocratic men, the aristocracy is very much like exclusive club membership, right? There's a certain amount of equality amongst people of similar birth. Now, while the knights are nowhere near the equal of the upper nobility, often they only possess their peasants and maybe their fiefs, right? But they're still called by the nobility for a lot of these important councils, and it's important to work these guys into the system because you need their local power on their way, right? So they're separated by birth and by wealth, but these guys are united together by war because they're going to be the war fighters and they're the ones that form these psychological bonds. So you look at something like this, right? You guys can go to these medieval festivals and pay a lot of money to go to some of this dinner theater kind of stuff, especially down in Central Florida. And you get a good sense of this. Now, nobody on the slide here is poor, right? This is not where the poor folks live, right? But you can see the gradients of the hierarchy. You get the king, the queen, maybe the princess, I don't know. But then you've got the lesser nobility, and you can see that even kind of the upper nobility here, and then the decreasing importance as they get further away. It gives you an idea of this hierarchy. So on the one hand, they're all sort of segmented in their own little slots, but they're all together. So that's a good idea to give you sort of some thoughts on how these guys worked. Right? Women have a whole different set of rules that apply to them. Right? Women were often controlled by their husbands or their fathers, and they become useful in many cases for political and economic reasons as vessels for transferring property. Women, generally speaking, weren't going to outright control whatever they inherit. There were a few exceptions to this, right? They could inherit and they could own property, but generally speaking, it was then going to be their husband or something like that, a brother that was going to control this. Now, women did play a strong role in administration, but it had to be behind the scenes in some cases, in the bedchamber. Women were becoming extremely adept at using their sexuality, in some cases, to parlay that for political power, right? Or in some cases, it was behind the scenes kind of counseling of who's related to whom and using these political machinations to get this going. The most famous of these was Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was extremely politically active, despite the fact that she never was completely in charge of anything, technically, in her life. She married two different kings, King of France and the King of England. She went on a crusade. She helped her sons attempt to rebel and seize the throne of England. And so she was very politically active, despite the fact that women at this point couldn't do anything by themselves legally, but they could really get a lot of stuff done. We don't have any actual photographs or contemporary etchings of Eleanor of Aquitaine, other than the fact that she was supposedly the most beautiful woman of Europe. So, the photo on the right, why not, right? That's what she could have looked like. Here's another one of our noble women. And I like to think that she's hard at work. She's working on something because in many cases in the master's absence or something like that, women played an even increasing amount of administrative roles when they could find the power. Now, one of the cultural traditions that we're left with is of chivalry. There's fact and then there's fiction. And we're going to see that most of it is fiction, but it's fiction that reveals an interesting fact. I hope I didn't lose you on that one, right? Chivalry is very much, when you look at it in its literary context, it's this ideal of knighthood, right? The men, they're physically strong and imposing, and in some cases you'll see superhumanly capable in battle. These are Christian guys. These are Christian warriors. They hold to this. Now, they're extremely fierce in battle. Some of the battle scenes in these medieval romances are particularly brutal. These guys, they're getting cut in half by swords and stuff like that. But once the battle is over, they're kind. At least they're supposed to be, right? They're very respectful of women, and of course they are above all honorable in every single situation, right? One of the particularly popular activities at this point, of course, is jousting, where these guys practice knocking each other off each other's horses with lances. That was ever increasingly becoming less necessary, but the joust and the other, the melee activities of these festivals would continue on, and these guys, are going to joust for the honor of women or political reasons, or they're going to gamble or whatever, and so you'll see that these are the chivalric pursuits. Now, this was rarely achieved in practice. So what you're seeing is you look at this and you go, these guys weren't really like this? No. These are the romances. This is what especially women of this period wanted to read, and so this is something that's going to be produced for a lot of times these noble women. So we don't get a lot. You can't look at this and see some of the King Arthur stories from the 13th century or anything like that and get a lot of ideas about fact. But it gives us a nice little window into, okay, well, who is it that would want to read this? Why do they want a romance? Well, because probably the guys around them aren't actually doing this, but they would very much like it. So these are the scenes, right, of chivalry. The guy he's guarding this woman who's probably not even his wife, and he's going to respect her chastity and devotion to her rightful husband and things like that. Anyway, this is what women want. Right? They didn't want to be divorced by some strange man, right? And then, of course, you get the enemy down, who's, of course, tied this poor woman to a tree, and you give him the opportunity to surrender because you're an honorable person, right? You don't just kill him. And so these are just a few scenes of this, right? What about the church and its role with the aristocracy, right? Now, the church played an integral role here in making sure that the aristocracy was an ongoing phenomenon, right? It tried to limit war, it encouraged marriage, especially the legal ties between families, and also continued to play its role in discouraging heresy, right? The church liked these games, these military games, because they were outlets for war. And then also, as we're going to talk about a little bit later, they preached the Crusades, because this is going to provide a great outlet to get a lot of these great noble warriors out of Europe. These guys are going to fight each other. Eventually, they'll have a great warlord will rise up. It's allegedly anti-Christian, but also poses a number of political problems for the church. Hey, let's just evacuate these guys to the Middle East, and then we won't have to worry about them The church's official position on marriage was that it was a holy institution, but of course it uses its position as the arbiters of what is marriage, which is a Christian institution, right, to give sanction to property transfers. This is how, when you don't have any sons, this is how you make sure that somebody is going to take over your land. You do it through your daughter. You marry her off, you have a dynastic marriage, political marriages, etc. And so this is what they're going to do, is they're going to come in with these aristocratic marriages, and they're going to enshrine them with the force of Christian law, right? The church also declared groups of heretics. A good example of this is the massacre of the Cathars in southwest France in the 12th century. So you'll have scenes like this where the Christian guys, the Catholic guys, are going to come in and they're going to smash these people, right? And they're going to kill them like crazy. One of the other major sociological changes that's taking place is not only in the countryside or even politically with the nobility, but in urbanization, right? The cities have really suffered from the Germanic invasions at the end of the Roman period. As the Roman Empire kind of implodes in on itself, the de-urbanizing cultural trend of the Germanic barbarians is one that not only do they attack the cities and they kind of lay waste to them, but also you're going to see that the replacement civilizations, they don't really like the cities very much. They're a rural kind of base, the fiefdoms and the land holdings, etc. But what you're going to see is over the course of the centuries, trade is really going to help reinvigorate a lot of these places. You'll see oceanic trade in the Mediterranean, on the North Sea, the Baltic Sea with the Hanseatic League, but also overland trade, so that crossroad towns like Paris are going to become important centers for economic activity. And so the nobles like this because one of the problems they've got is they may be land rich, but cash poor. And so a lot of these nobles that can control some of this trade going through these different places like the cities and want to support them ever increasingly because they're a good way to generate cash that they can tap into for economic expansion. And when you see the medieval city, this is what you'll see going on. Economic activity. People trading, people buying, people selling, construction activities, the building of churches and cathedrals. These are the activities that take place here, right? Now, as the cities begin to grow, they seek a special status for their citizens because they have to move around more and they have to have a little bit more freedom. Workers have to inhabit towns in order to manufacture, to work in the warehouses, to become skilled artisans. And what you're going to see, generally speaking, and there's no kind of boilerplate answer to say, well, all cities in the medieval world were like this. But generally speaking, the nobles were amenable in some cases to allowing for more freedom than they would for, say, peasants down on the the fief plantation, down on the farm, right? Because this equaled a greater cash flow for them. Now, there were varying levels of freedom that they allowed. Some of them were often free cities. You can kind of go in, it would have mayors. It was actually a pretty liberal-looking place by these standards. And then some, only a limited amount of freedom, and there was a great deal of aristocratic control. So there's some variances. We're also going to see construction of walls around a lot of these places, bigger than just the castle itself, but the entire city is going to become a walled fortification. And as I mentioned, they're going to be allowed a pretty healthy amount of self-rule, right? So you'll see the mayoral office and the expansions of churches into these massive cathedrals due to the ever-increasing amount of money. The towns in Northern Europe tended to still be governed directly from the crown, but ever increasingly, for example, Italian trading cities had a lot more independence than some of these other places, right? So you can see these ports of call here in the Hanseatic League in the north, and then also in many of the river and road systems of Central Europe as well. And as you get into them, you'll see that space is very much at a premium due to what's going on. And so you'll see that the economic activity has to kind of take place in this very narrow confines, and the buildings go up and out a little bit more to try to maximize as much space as possible, and that is due to the constraining effects of the walls. You'll have a lot of these people engaged in various forms of industry, whether it's milling of the grain in the town, or these guys making shoes, the shoemakers here in these big kind of workshop type facilities, or I really don't know what that guy's doing, but he's got a giant mechanical hammer, so it's pretty cool looking, right? So these are what some of these people are doing, right? So as I mentioned, the cities are going to be pretty crowded, and they're going to be pretty nasty, especially by our standards today, right? The streets are very narrow, and the housings were tightly as packed together and multi-story because they're trying to save as much space as they can, because you've got a choice. You either pack in as tightly as you can and you live within the walls and are protected, or you can kind of go outside the walls, which you're going to have more room, but you're now unprotected, all right? So it's pretty filthy by our standards, pretty much any standard, right? Water, sewage, fire, all of these are issues that are pretty problematic. But the cities are going to attract traveling merchants and the artisans of all types, because this is a place where they can rather efficiently ply their trade and make money. We'll see that in the towns also is going to be the most liberating spot for women, because women were allowed to have a certain level of autonomy, either in trades, and there were a few businesses that women were allowed to run in some sort of fashion, you know, like bed and breakfast kind of thing, we would call a tavern or inn, right? And these craft guilds are also going to evolve with this growing social life to provide some kind of system of artisan control of these laborers in pretty much all of these industries. Pretty much all of them are skilled. Unlike what you'll see later, and we'll talk about this in world history too, with industrialization, where a lot of those people are going to be unskilled. These are skilled laborers who are trying to control a market. That would have taken place. And so you can see this is one of these northern European walled cities and how tightly they get packed here inside this wall, and how they've got to maximize the space, get as close together as you can, and even if you have to build a room over one of the roads. And this is a German town. You get this from kind of the three-quarters bird's eye view of just how packed these places are and how tight the roads kind of wind together to get an idea of that. And that's all due to the compression of space. The Guild of Master Craftsmen, this is something that you can join now, but they use the ancient European, or at least the medieval European, woodworker as their symbol. And while this style of art is a little bit later than what we're talking about here, this is the painting of the Dutch masters, and this is what you'd see as you were trying to advance your career in various industries. The board of the masters would meet and you'd show them your work, whether or not you could advance in your field within your labor organization. Come on. There we go. One of the other products here is an increased uptick in intellectual activity. Right now, the university system is going to begin in Europe at this point, but it's going to start out as an outgrowth of these religious seminaries. For a long time, the only way to get a serious education was via the church. The church was educating both men and women so that they can engage in church activities. But there'll be some ancillary activities that we see them engage with as well. Translating old texts, transcribing ancient manuscripts, most Christian, some ancient philosophical texts and things like that. But as this becomes more settled and they begin to expand their scope of study, we're going to see that a number of people want an education, who they don't want to become priests, they don't want to go through the church, but they want to get an education, and there's an ever-growing need for them in both government and in private business to give them jobs. So there's going to be an economic component to this as well. Like I said, the administrative bureaucracies of these growing government creates a number of job opportunities for college-educated people. And so the universities would generally focus on what we would call today kind of a liberal arts program of study. There were also some subsequent specialist degrees that you could go for as well. Law, medicine, and then of course religious, which makes a lot of sense given the seminary roots of most of these places of higher learning. These are the scholars that are going to be pouring through some of these classical texts. Also, they're the ones that are going to be digging through Roman law, and ever increasingly are trying to use what we would call reason to underscore an understanding of faith and theology. But this is also the institution and these processes that are going to help create and spread a lot of this romantic prose and poetry. And of course, the best example of this are the Arthurian texts that are going to come out as well. And there you can see this is a pretty typical medieval university classroom. As you can see, way, way different than what you've got nowadays in college, where you've got some stuffed shirt guys up in front of all these other people, and he's blah, 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 and he's just yapping, and the people there, some of them are paying attention and following along, some of them are sort of paying attention, some of them are talking to their friends, and then some of these guys have actually fallen asleep. So way, way different than a college classroom now. And this is the medieval scholar. He's trying to use human reason to pierce through the dome of the world and into the ether, right? Into this quintessential fifth element beyond all understanding. But I love this one because he's actually got his head stuck through there. But this is the goal here for a lot of these people. And of course, one of the problems that college students had then that we don't have now is they would get together and they would party and they would drink too much. So again, it was one of those issues that time has washed away. College students no longer drink too much. And of course, it leads to the question that since a lot of these institutions, especially were boarding schools, and so tight disciplinary control was something that they were really worried about, right? You may ask yourself, what do they do with somebody who really got drunk all the time, or what do they do with college students that were caught drinking? At least one of these institutions, what they would do is they would make him wear the beer barrel all day, which seems like a pretty fitting punishment for a drunk with this one, right? Good evidence here of where the medieval mind is in the 11th and 12th centuries, the Gothic movement, right? It's this movement of massive, especially church architecture, that really gives us a nice window here into the medieval mind, right? First of all, it took the entire community to build one cathedral. Also, as you're going to see, it's a multi-generational project. This isn't something that you put together in like 2 years or 5 years. In some of these cases, it's like 40, 50, 60, 70 years to complete. So it shows you that they're really committed to what they're doing religiously in terms of providing an urban center for their activities. When you look at the architectural style itself, it gives you a pretty good idea of what their view of their preoccupation with Christianity, where you have these soaring spires, you have a great deal of verticality in terms of everything is kind of pointing up, massive size designed to dwarf the human form. All of this is going to do this pretty succinctly, right? Now, the way that this works out socially is, of course, the peasants and the workmen, they're going to provide the heavy labor. They're the ones who are actually doing this. But a number of artisans, these skilled laborers, masons, glassmakers, etc., tapestry weavers, all these kind of statuary, all this, they're going to provide the skilled labor to make this into just, instead of a building, an actual work of art, right? The merchants are going to provide the cash and monetary flow, and of course you've got to have some rare items, such as a dish used by a saint, or perhaps one of his bones from his little finger or something like that to get people to come there, right? The nobility, of course, are going to provide the leadership and the structure for all of this. So when you look at this, you can see how everything is huge, it's all pointed up, it's all going towards heaven. It gives you this idea of a vanishing point in the sky. Inside these cathedrals are also works of art with these giant sort of vaulted ceilings, hanging lanterns, statuary, the gold inlay, the tapestry, the rugs. All of this is impressive inside and out. You have these huge stained glass windows, giant works of art, and from top to bottom, this gives you an idea of kind of how committed these people were, and it gives you a nice little window into what's evolving with the aristocracy, what's evolving with workers at this point, what's evolving with urbanization and trade and merchants, and then, of course, how the church is woven into all of this. And we'll see next time what happens when this goes from sort of pointing inward to also then pointing outward.